Welcome to a rare conversation with one of the most consequential business builders of our age. In this acquired interview, recorded in his office in Taipei, the hosts sit down with Morris Chang, the founder of Taiwan's Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC, the company that makes the chips inside almost every advanced device on Earth. Chang was 93 at the time, and this was his first long-form video interview in 17 years. The introduction was arranged by Nvidia's Jensen Huang. Having just published the second volume of his memoirs after a 26-year gap, Chang was in a storytelling mood. What follows is not a tidy life history. It is a set of the specific, vivid episodes he chose to recount. The mental tool he has used for 50 years, the insight that created a new kind of company, and the make-or-break moments with Nvidia and Apple. We've organized them so the through line is easy to follow. The learning curve, Chang's master tool. If there is one idea underneath everything Morris Chang built, it is the learning curve, sometimes called the experience curve, and he is scrupulous about crediting where he learned it. Around 1970, when Texas Instruments was the largest semiconductor company in the world, Bruce Henderson, the founder of the Boston Consulting Group and often called the father of competitive strategy, cold called TI's chief executive Mark Shepard to pitch the theory. Shepard agreed, and assigned Chang as TI's point person opposite Henderson's brilliant young protege, Bill Bain. For roughly 2 years, Bain worked out of a small office next to Chang's, poring over the costs and prices of TI's many chip families and flying back to Boston midweek to report. Chang absorbed it all. The simple version is that as you make more of something, the unit cost falls. But, as he warns, if you stop at that simple version, you really haven't learned anything at all. He came to treat it as a deep thinking tool about cost, volume, and competition, one he says he still uses to this day. That relationship, incidentally, had a footnote. Bain eventually confided to Chang that he was leaving to start his own firm, citing the Oedipal imperative, and went on to found Bain and Company. The pure-play foundry idea. Chang founded TSMC in 1987, at the age of 56. The idea was radical. A semiconductor factory that would manufacture chips for other companies and never design or sell chips of its own. A dedicated, pure-play foundry, a phrase that appears right on his original business plan. The hosts, who had seen that plan in the TSMC museum, suggested the model was chosen defensively because Taiwan couldn't hope to catch Intel at designing chips. Chang pushed back on that framing. He never said TSMC would never catch Intel. He insisted, "Look where we are in 2025. He was equally firm that the plan was always ambitious. Asked whether he had originally meant to stop building after the second fab, he said no, that was only the very initial plan, and that as a serious student of the learning curve he would never stop at just 2. The company passed $1 billion in revenue by 1995, less than a decade after its founding. Seeing fables coming. Where did the confidence in a foundry come from? Chang says, plainly, that he saw the fables movement coming, the rise of companies that would design chips but own no factories. He tells 2 stories from his final months at General Instrument. In the first, an entrepreneur named Gordon Campbell came asking General Instrument for a $50 million investment to start a company, with the whole plan in his head. Weeks later, Campbell called back to say he no longer needed the money. He now needed only $5 million, because he wasn't going to build a factory at all. In the second, the founder of Apple came having already started his company with no fabs, wanting General Instrument's empty factories to make his wafers, and the friction was instant, because the customer wanted the fab run his way while the fab manager owned the fab. That tension crystallized the whole opportunity. As Chang puts it, the difficulty of a foundry is that everyone wants the fab run his way, but you can only run a fab one way that satisfies more or less all customers. And the advantage is that you then get to have a great many customers. The rule that made TSMC trusted. The single principle that made the foundry model work, in Chang's telling, is that TSMC does not compete with its own customers. No products of its own, no designs of its own, nothing that puts it across the table from the people it serves. That is what builds trust. He learned how rare that trust was from the inside. He knew many of Intel's customers among Taiwan's PC makers, and by his account, none of them liked Intel. They all wished for another supplier. His explanation is almost startlingly simple. Customers ask for many things, he says, And some of the requests are crazy, even irrational, but TSMC responds to each one courteously, which Intel never did. Years later, Apple's Tim Cook would give Chang the same idea in one line, when he reassured him there was nothing to worry about from Intel because, in Cook's words, Intel just does not know how to be a foundry. Jensen's letter and the Nvidia beginning. One of the warmest stories is the beginning of the Nvidia relationship around 1997. It started with a letter Jensen Huang mailed to Chang in Hsinchu, after Nvidia had approached TSMC's California office and gotten no answer, something that both piqued Chang's curiosity and irritated him, because he had always preached that no future customer, however small, should be neglected. Nvidia was then 4 years old, facing bankruptcy, with perhaps 50 or 60 employees, while TSMC already had thousands and over $1 billion in revenue. Chang simply called the number on the stationery, unannounced. Amid background noise, Jensen picked up, then shouted to his team the now famous line, "Quiet, Morris Chang is calling me." At their meeting, Jensen was frank that Nvidia was in financial trouble, but promised the chip he wanted manufactured would not only save the company, but make Nvidia a major TSMC customer. It was a games chip, and it was a huge success. Within 2 or 3 years, Nvidia was among TSMC's top 5 customers. The 2009 crisis and taking back the reins. Not every chapter is warm. By 2009, Chang had handed the chief executive title to a successor while remaining chairman, and a cluster of problems converged. On the 40-nanometer node, where Nvidia was the biggest customer, TSMC had both a quality problem and a yield problem, and the interim management, insisting TSMC was not at fault, had offered Nvidia essentially nothing. At the same time, prices were falling faster than costs, squeezing margins, and the previous CEO had used poor performance reviews to lay off 600 or 700 people, circumventing Chang's long-standing rule against layoffs. Chang had always argued it was wrong to lay off by performance ratings, because those ratings are subjective judgments made by each person's own supervisor, and because if you need the people back within a year, you shouldn't have let them go at all. The fallout was painful. Laid-off employees protested outside his home. In one of the interview's most human moments, his wife Sophie, unable to sleep, rose at 6 in the morning, took a bodyguard, bought Chinese breakfast for the 2 or 3 dozen protesters camped nearby, and handed it out, after which they thanked her and abandoned their plan to march on the presidential palace. Chang retook the chief executive job to set things right, settling with Nvidia, pizza, salad, and 48 hours. Fixing the Nvidia dispute became one of Chang's first priorities back in the CEO's seat, and the way he did it is pure Morris Chang. Over several weeks, he personally worked out a fair settlement number, gathering all the intelligence he could, including the fact that Nvidia's own customers were pressing it. Then he emailed Jensen to say he'd be in Silicon Valley and would come to Jensen's home at 6 for just salad and pizza, the kind of meal they'd shared many times. Jensen wrote straight back, "When do we discuss business then?" So Chang scheduled it to the half-hour. Pizza and salad at 6:30, made with the help of Jensen's wife Lori, and business in the study at 8. There, Chang laid down an offer of more than $100 million, with unusual terms. It was effective for 48 hours. There would be no arguing and no bargaining. And if Nvidia didn't accept, the matter would go to an arbitrator. Chang thought it fair to both sides. Jensen accepted within 2 days, and the relationship went on to generate many billions of dollars of business. Chang liked the story enough, he says, to put it in his autobiography. Winning Apple. The Apple story begins with a surprise dinner. Chang came home one evening to find Sophie at the door telling him that her cousin Terry Goh, the founder of Foxconn, was coming for dinner and bringing a vice president from Apple. The visitor turned out to be Jeff Williams, Apple's chief operating officer, not an ordinary VP at all. Williams began pitching almost as soon as he sat down. Apple wanted TSMC to manufacture its chips. He offered to let TSMC keep a 40% gross margin. Chang said nothing, because TSMC's margins were already 45% and climbing. There were twists. Apple wanted the 20-nanometer node, an awkward half-step detour off TSMC's roadmap, and crucially, Apple had not been part of the plan when TSMC bet billions on 28 nanometers. It arrived, in Chang's words, as a pleasant surprise. to finance serving even half of Apple's demand. Chang leaned on relationships he had planted years earlier at Goldman Sachs, chose not to cut the dividend and not to issue stock, but to borrow, and told Apple TSMC would supply only half of what it asked. Bet the company, he says of the moment, but I didn't think I would lose. When Intel's chief executive made a late approach to Tim Cook, Chang was unworried, judging TSMC's technology at par, its manufacturing better, and its customer trust higher. And Cook, hosting him in the Apple cafeteria, confirmed as much. There was a sting later, when TSMC's 20-nanometer detour delayed its own 16-nanometer work, and Apple placed its first 16-nanometer orders with Samsung. But TSMC caught up within about half a year and won back most of the business. The IBM lesson: own your own technology. A quieter story carries one of Chang's sharpest lessons. In the late 1990s, the chipmaker Qualcomm, which TSMC had long courted without much success, suddenly began shifting its business to TSMC. Chang immediately deduced that Qualcomm's existing foundry, IBM, must be in trouble. Soon after, IBM proposed that TSMC co-develop the next process node, the 0.13 micron generation. Chang refused, he says, without having to think about it at all. IBM would have considered itself the senior partner, and sending TSMC's engineers into IBM's culture would have cost the company its ability to develop its own manufacturing process, its ability to control its own destiny. IBM, offended, took the offer to TSMC's smaller rival UMC, which accepted, only to regret it seriously a few years later. The principle stuck. At the leading edge, you own your own technology, or you don't really own your future. Betting on 28 nanometers. Perhaps the defining bet of Chang's later years was 28 nanometers. After he returned as CEO, he made one decision he calls the best thing they ever did for research. He fixed the R&D budget at 8% of revenue, every year, recession or not, ending the annual haggling that had kept it lower. Freed to think big, his R&D team told him 28 nanometers would be the sweet spot, like the center of a tennis racket, and he chose to believe them. That conviction meant tripling capital spending to around $6 billion a year, a bet his largely overseas board strongly resisted, until he told them that he was still the man responsible for running the company, and they needed to let him proceed. He framed the moment with Shakespeare, a line he quotes in his memoir. There is a tide in the affairs of men, which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. The tide, as it turned out, was the smartphone era, and the 28-nanometer bet met a wave of demand he admits he did not fully see coming. Leadership, no layoffs, functional structure, and rainmaking. Finally, the interview reveals the management philosophy beneath the stories. Under Chang, TSMC essentially never did layoffs and never fired by performance rating. The worst case was a probation period after which most people returned to their jobs. He fought hard to keep the company organized by function rather than split into divisions by fab, even hiring McKinsey, which confirmed his instinct and pointed to Boeing as a functionally organized giant, because a foundry serves almost the same set of customers across all its factories. He drew a careful line between sales, which is tactical work with customers, and marketing, which is the strategic work of shaping the outside world, and he built a business development function to do the latter. For years, he was TSMC's own chief rainmaker, on a plane most of the time visiting customers, always meeting the current top 15 while hunting the next 15, the discipline that found Nvidia and so many others. And when it came time to choose a successor, he tested his candidates by offering the strategically vital but small business development role. The executive who turned it down because it commanded too few people revealed something, while C.C. Wei, who took it, even delightfully, went on to become the chairman and chief executive who leads TSMC today.